Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm really happy to present it at this conference with so many people participating. Yeah, nice benefit of this Zoom era that we have now. Yeah, so I have a little bit of a presentation, just mostly to give the structure of the talk and then to give the main passages which I will be quoting on the way. So I will first present like the big question of the talk is basically about the relation between the tasks of the philosophy of nature, as Hegel conceived it, and the empirical science. Right? And I first will discuss a little bit this Schellingian background to it, and then present one reading of what Hegel thought about this relation between these two tasks. That presented by Alison Stone in her really good book on Hegel, The Petrified Intelligence. And then I will, criticize is basically her view and give some evidence for an alternative view that I myself will present. So basically, on my reading, Hegel does believe that in a manner pretty similar to that of Schelling, that natural philosophy, like at least the basic outlines of something of what he presents in his natural philosophy is actually can play this kind of guiding role for empirical science in an ideal world, right? So in practice, he didn't exercise that much of an influence on empirical science, but that's was sort of his thought, at least on my reading of him. Okay, so around the turn of the 18th, 19th centuries, the most influential attempt to rethink the concept of nature was embodied in the movement that is now known as Naturphilosophie, or then known. This attempt was not confined to philosophical circles, but rather encompassed a number of figures involved in active scientific research and medical practice. In Germany, its most influential philosophical representative was Friedrich Schelling, and a number of prominent scientists, both in and outside of Germany, were influenced by his ideas in one way or another. For example, one can think of such names as Hans Christian Ørsted or Johann Wilhelm Ritter, known respectively for discoveries of electromagnetism and ultraviolet rays, as well as some other things. Moreover, both Schelling and such lesser-known natural philosophers as Lorenz Oken and Henrik Steffens meant their philosophy of nature to influence scientific research. And indeed, Schelling explicitly addressed the question of the relation between his philosophy of nature, or speculative physics, as he calls it, to empirical natural science. In his introduction to the first outline of the philosophy of nature, he claims that the goal of the philosophy of nature is to strive to deduce all natural phenomena from its first principles, a task which he says is infinite. Now, Schelling is emphatic that this does not mean that it should be done without any intervention of experience, or that speculative physics is supposed to be able to spin all its principles out of itself, as he says. So the picture is somewhat more complicated. So he says, not only do we know this or that through experience, but we originally know nothing at all except through experience and by means of experience. And in this sense, the whole of our knowledge consists of the judgments of experience. These judgments become a priori principles when we become conscious of them as necessary. Sorry. Sorry. Yeah, so Schelling suggests that our empirical knowledge of natural phenomena is converted to a priori knowledge once we gain insight into its internal necessity, as he says, by deducing it within the philosophy of nature. Now, Schelling thinks that that empirical knowledge itself is obtained with the help of at least some non-empirical assumptions. Thus, he writes in a Kantian vein that every experiment is a question put to nature, to which it is compelled to give a reply. But every question contains an implicit a priori judgment. Every experiment that is an experiment is a prophecy. No, I think that's just a mistake. Every experiment is a prophecy. Experiment in itself is a production of phenomena. And a couple of pages later, he adds that it is conceivable that speculative physics, the soul of true experimentation, has throughout all time been the mother of all great discoveries in nature, thus suggesting that philosophy of nature has a certain guiding role even for empirical researchers who did not have access to its formulation, perhaps as just a presupposition of the systematicity of nature. So because he says throughout all time, so also during the time that he didn't have any such, didn't present anything like this philosophy of nature. And later, Schelling elaborates on how he sees this guiding role that his philosophy of nature is supposed to play as follows. He says, now we may indeed be quite certain that every natural phenomenon, through whatever number of intermediate links, stands in connection with the last conditions of nature. The intermediate links themselves, however, may be unknown to us and still lie hidden in the depths of nature. To find out these links is the work of experimental research. Speculative physics has nothing to do but to show the need of these intermediate links. So I think he's here talking exactly about some specifics about how this speculative physics or philosophy of nature is supposed to play this guiding role for science. And indeed about the explicitly formulated philosophy of nature, not about some implicit assumptions about nature being cognizable or systematic. So he says that philosophy of nature and empirical science are supposed to collaborate at the intermediate level between the first principles of philosophy of nature and the phenomena of nature. And his vision of this collaboration seems to be that the philosophy of nature is supposed to indicate the relations between various categories that can be used to explain natural phenomena and the way they are connected to the first principles, whereas empirical science, by means of experimentation, is supposed to find correspondent natural phenomena, or as he also suggests at other places in the vicinity of this passage, it can also falsify the work done in the philosophy of nature. So if we cannot show that certain types of natural phenomena are deducible within this natural philosophy, then it falsifies the assumptions, he says. I believe this already gives us at least some general picture of the interplay between the philosophy of nature and empirical science as Schelling saw it. So on the one hand, the general idea that nature is something that is a systematic whole that is in principle cognizable by us is an necessary implicit assumption for all researchers, even those who didn't have access to something like Schelling's philosophy of nature, right? Never heard of it. Whereas those researchers who engage with this philosophy of nature, with Schelling philosophy of nature, can use it for more specific guidance in the manner that he indicates in this passage in particular. Of course, it's still, there's a lot more to say about this, but I think at least this gives us a rough picture. And later in his life, Schelling actually talks about the discoveries in electromagnetism, and he actually says that he claims that his philosophy of nature actually exercised this guiding role in the development of electromagnetism. That's in the text Über Faraday's Neueste Entdeckung, and it at least has some plausibility in the case of Ørsted, as I already indicated. So his work in electromagnetism was kind of influenced by Schelling. Okay, so we get this Schellingian background, and now the question that I'd like to ask is whether Hegel, as another major philosopher who developed his own philosophy of nature, had a somewhat similar picture or not, or what did he think about the tasks of philosophy of nature and empirical science, whether they can collaborate in some kind of this sort of way that Schelling indicates, or is his view completely different? That's kind of the question for this talk. And one answer to this I found in, as I already indicated, in Alison Stone's book, Petrified Intelligence. And her answer is negative to the, so she says that, she argues that although Hegel has sharply distinguished between the metaphysics that he presents in his philosophy of nature, and that is typically, or on her reading, essentially presupposed in empirical science, and although he also believes that his philosophy of nature, or his metaphysics, is superior to that presupposed in natural sciences, so he still thought on Stone's reading that science should proceed on the basis of its own inadequate metaphysics or inferior metaphysics. And then the task of his philosophy of nature, or Hegelian philosophy of nature, is to continually reinterpret the results delivered by natural science in its own terms. Now, the idea that, yeah, this is a kind of surprising, puzzling an idea that for science to be guided by inadequate, or at least less adequate metaphysics is better, or than for it to be guided by more adequate metaphysics. So it's a bit of a puzzling idea, but she defends it. She gives some arguments for it. So I want to look at some arguments that she provides. But first, before that, I want to, to say something about the two kinds of metaphysics under discussion that Hegel distinguishes from each other. So Stone argues that while Hegel himself believed that nature is rational, and we can kind of bracket the details for the moment, empirical scientists presupposed what she calls the metaphysics of bare things, whose behavior is intrinsically meaningless. And thus precisely they presuppose that nature is not rational. And scientists on Stone's reading of Hegel explain the behavior of these bare things by postulating universals and laws which are supposed to ground natural phenomena. And Stone believes that these features, including the assumption that natural phenomena, or that nature is not rational, are essential for the practice of empirical science. And this is the passage, maybe the most important, where she argues for this. So she says that science for Hegel is defined by its empirical method of moving from observational givens to universal forms and laws. This empirical procedure is motivated and underpinned by the scientific belief that nature is a realm of bare things. So just bare things which are not rational. From Hegel's perspective, then, a supposedly alternative science, such as the one Schelling envisioned, would not really be a science at all, as it would necessarily forsake the empirical method that defines science as such. Yet this empirical method is just what is valuable about science for Hegel, enables scientists to learn about nature's contingent features. So she says, she seems to argue here that the assumption of the metaphysics of bare things, or the denial of rationality of nature, is what allows science to be empirical, as opposed to some a priori procedure of the philosophy of nature. And in turn, this empiricism is what allows scientists to learn those contingent features of nature that cannot be deduced a priori, those which are due to, in Hegel's terminology, to the impotence of nature, or Ohnmacht der Natur. So I think that, well, there are some things that she gets right? I mean, as I already said, yeah, Hegel doesn't distinguish his own adequate metaphysics from that typically presupposed in empirical science. And for example, in this passage, we can see him doing just that, I think. So he says, Newton, explicitly said that, Newton said basically that physics shouldn't engage in any kind of metaphysics, but actually he wasn't consistent with his own requirement, right? And in fact, Hegel basically says here, yeah, in fact, only the animals are really pure physicists, in the sense that they are not engaged in any kind of metaphysics, because while man as a thinking being is a born metaphysician, but the only thing that matters, Hegel says, so we always have some kind of metaphysics, as he's saying here. But the thing that matters is whether the metaphysics that one employs is of the right kind, and in particular, whether instead of the concrete logical idea, one holds on to one-sided or determinations fixed by the understanding, so that they form the basis both of our theoretical and of our practical action. So yeah, one thing to notice here is that he says, yeah, Newton and other scientists, they always presuppose some kind of metaphysics. What he says is the metaphysics of the understanding, and he contrasts it with his own metaphysics of the concrete logical idea. So he rules out the possibility that science proceeds without any metaphysics, and so some kind of positivist contrast between science and metaphysics cannot be ascribed to Hegel. Right? And that's consistent with Stone's story so far. There are other texts. So this text is from the Zusatz. Some people might find a problem with that, but I think there are other texts which are quite consistent with this. However, this text by itself does not show that all scientists, in fact, assume that nature is not rational or presuppose this kind of inadequate metaphysics of the understanding that is to be contrasted with Hegelian metaphysics. And still less does it show that this assumption is essential for empirical science, right? Which is what Stone claims. And well, can we find those stronger claims in Hegel? Well, as Stone herself kind of says, rightfully, that Hegel does not actually say that much about something like the methodology of science or assumptions of science. So we have to kind of pull it out. Discussions that may or may not be exactly relevant to this issue. It's an interpretative issue there. Well, as far as I can see, Stone supports her stronger thesis that it's essential for empirical science to assume that nature is not rational, right, to this kind of inadequate metaphysics. So firstly, on the basis of texts about ground, for example, in the science of logic, where Hegel talks about formal and real ground, and there are also texts about explanation in both the phenomenology of spirit and about the understanding, the Verstand in the philosophy of spirit in the encyclopedia. And I cannot really discuss that in detail here, right, in this talk. But I think what we can at least say that, well, it still remains, even if what he says there aligns with Stone's argument, it still does not show that the standpoint of understanding or the standpoint of explanation in this kind of sense that he was talking about there is essential to empirical science, right? It can be just that he is discussing a certain stage, which a lot of scientists also occupy, in fact, but it doesn't show that it is essential for empirical science, as far as I can see. The other argument that Stone presents, which is, I think, maybe we can see in this passage specifically, is well, she seems to assume that if we accept something like Hegelian metaphysics, rationalist metaphysics, then we cannot really proceed on the basis of this assumption. At least we cannot proceed in a generally empirical manner. And she doesn't really explain why. And it is kind of puzzling, I think, because the picture that we found in Schelling at the beginning of the talk, right, on the relation between speculative physics and empirical research is, I think, a picture of an empirical investigation that is guided by rationalist metaphysics. So it's not a purely empirical, it contains some kind of a priori elements, but I think it's still an empirical project that he outlines there. And I think that what underlines Stone's argument are some kind of residual empiricist or positivist assumptions according to which metaphysics is harmful for scientific practice. So as Hegel himself alludes in this passage, that's what Newton expresses, right? This kind of view, but does not, himself himself consistent with this kind of claim. Right? And Stone rightly sees that Hegel denies that we can do without metaphysics, but she still, on my understanding, she still thinks that maybe even though scientists cannot do without metaphysics, that should proceed in accordance with some kind of minimalist metaphysics. So any kind of rich rationalist metaphysics would be distorting, would inevitably distort empirical investigation and prevent science to learn about nature's contingent features, as she says, because it starts by assuming too much about nature. So that's how I understand this argument of hers. Okay, but I find this argument not really philosophically convincing and also historically untenable. So philosophically, I find it implausible that a set, well, I find it on the contrary plausible that even if we have some kind of strong substantive assumptions about nature, they can still orient researchers and help them organize their empirical findings. So it might even be better in some way than if we don't have some substantive assumptions about nature. And actually, finding the empirically contingent features of nature might be easier, like if we make those stronger assumptions against their background, right? So if we see that actual observable phenomena deviate from the strong assumptions that we make, well, we can only see those deviations as deviations from those assumptions, not if we don't make those assumptions. So it's a kind of argument that similar to what Kuhn, for example, and Lakatos make about paradigms or research programs that organize research. That, yeah, if we make some kind of, if we have some expectations about what empirical research should yield, can we detect some small deviations from those expectations? Otherwise, if we don't make them, then we don't even see them as deviations, right? So that's kind of course, this by itself doesn't show that it's something like a rationalist metaphysics that should play this guiding role, but at least I think the reason that Stone gives here in this passage, that is shown not to be really a convincing reason by these considerations. Okay. And historically, I think it's also pretty clear that there were major scientists who, contributed to empirical science in some major way, who were actually guided by different versions of rationalist metaphysics in their work. And I already mentioned, for example, Ørsted and Ritter, who were guided by, or influenced at least, by Schellingian natural philosophy. But if we talk about rationalist metaphysics in general, then even more striking examples would be Leibniz or, for example, Johannes Kepler, who held some really strong Platonistic assumptions and were one of the biggest scientists one of the major protagonists of the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. So that shows that the argument itself, I think, is unconvincing that Stone presents here. But I also think its adscription to Hegel specifically is unconvincing because of his own assessment of precisely this kind of figures that I just mentioned. For example, Kepler, right? So he talks about Kepler specifically in the philosophy of nature, in the lectures on the philosophy of nature, and he ascribes to him precisely the strong belief in the rationality of nature, and he says that that's basically the reason why he succeeded, right? So I now present some passages where Hegel either talks about specific scientists or about scientists in general, and actually says that the assumption that nature is rational is essential, or at least important, for scientific practice. Right? So one passage we find at the end of his dissertation on the orbits of planets, where he says that the measure and number of nature cannot be alien to reason, nor do our pursuit and cognition of the laws of nature depend on anything other than that we believe nature to be shaped by reason and are convinced of the identity of all laws of nature. And here he speaks about scientists, right? Those who seek laws from experience and induction, whenever they by chance happen upon an appearance of a law, insofar as they recognize the identity of reason and nature, they are delighted. And if other phenomena agree with it insufficiently, they somewhat doubt the experiments and strive in every way to establish the harmony between them. So that seems to be exactly the opposite of what he should be saying on Stone's reading of him, right? That scientists proceed on the basis of assumption that nature is not rational, and that's what makes them genuinely empirical scientists, right? And at this point in the text, he is about to comment on specific speculations of astronomers concerning the progression of distances of planets from the sun. But this passage, I think, is more general. So he's making a more general point. So as presuppositions that scientists make, he mentions here the belief in the rationality of nature and in the identity of all laws of nature. This latter presumably should be understood as some kind of systematicity of the system of laws of nature, I would think, along the lines canvassed by Kant in the appendix to the dialectic and in the first critique and the introductions to the third critique. And we can think, well, I think this is, also agrees very much with what Schelling says in the passages we discussed at the beginning. And one can think, okay, this is the dissertation, so that's the time when Hegel was influenced by Schelling. Maybe we shouldn't, think that that's still his position in the mature system, right? For the mature Hegel. But actually, later in a very similar context, when he talks about Kepler in the encyclopedia, he says pretty similar things. Right? He says that he searched for his third law for 27 years, and he only this staunchness, which was based on the absolute faith that reason must be there in the solar system, that he arrived at this law. Right? So that was essential for his success, this belief in the rationality of nature. Another case is that of Goethe, right? And that's a different case. So I think it still points in the same direction. But the difference is that Hegel was kind of aware of the fact that Goethe was not really willing to endorse some kind of, or to canvass some kind of explicit philosophical position. Goethe says, for example, in an essay, Einwirkung der neueren Philosophie, he says, für Philosophie im eigentlichen Sinne hatte ich kein Organ. So he had no organ for philosophy proper. But so what Hegel says about Goethe is that he's someone who had a rich sense of nature, the Natursinn, and someone who has this kind of sense of nature can see the rational in nature or in history for Hegel. And what is interesting, though, is that when Hegel contrasts Goethe's and Newton's theories of colors, one of the main criticisms that he levels against Newton is precisely the latter's metaphysics, which, as we have seen above, Hegel sees as precisely the one that contrasts with his own rationalist metaphysics of nature. And thus, far from thinking that this so he's criticizing Newton in comparison to Goethe quite severely, right? And precisely because he accepts this sort of non-rationalist metaphysics, right? Metaphysics of the understanding. So far from thinking that this sort of metaphysics is essential to natural science, Hegel actually favors someone with as he says, a pure and simple sense of nature, who was able to provide the presentation of the colors that is adequate to the concept, as we can see in this passage here on the screen. And to go against the barbarism of reflection, which is found in Newton, as he says. Hegel's praise for Goethe's scientific research in the theory of colors, and also in other fields as botany, zoology, and meteorology, thus shows that he does not believe metaphysics of the Newtonian type to be essential for empirical science, even though Goethe himself wasn't, according to Hegel, was able to arrive at the view of rationality of nature without the guidance of something like his own rationalist metaphysics of nature. And he also says about Goethe that this passage. So Goethe's great sense let him say of this union of the distinct, that's he's talking about the Urphänomen of colors here, that is adequate to the concept. This is so not to deny it on the basis of some inadequate metaphysics that others like Newton held. Right? So yeah, this rationality is identity and enduring difference. That's for Hegel. And Goethe, because of his Natursinn, was able to just accept this and not to deny, not to allow some kind of prejudices to deny them. Okay. So that pretty much concludes my case for this point, for my reading of Hegel, that actually he did think that the assumption that nature is rational is actually conducive to empirical natural science, and by no means is it inimical to it. Yeah, I would formulate it like this. I mean, there's a further question. Okay, what did he have some kind of richer idea about how exactly his natural philosophy is able to guide, would be able to guide natural scientists? So we saw that Schelling has some somewhat specific things, at least to say, and that, for example, he actually claimed that his assumption about the unity of forces, like magnetic and electric and others, actually did play some guiding role in actual scientific practice. So for Hegel, yeah, as I mentioned, he wasn't as influential as Schelling on actual science, and he didn't say that much about methodology of scientific research. So anything I can say here is really conjectural. But at least I would say, well, I think his reading of, on my reading of his philosophy of nature, Hegel really consistently expresses an anti-reductionist position there. And he always believes that phenomena that belong to different spheres of nature, to higher spheres of nature, cannot be completely explained through phenomena that belong to lower spheres. So for example, organic phenomena cannot be completely exhaustively explained by reference to mechanical or chemical processes and causes. And so at least his philosophy of nature has this kind of negative guidance, right? It rules out the projects that would aim at the complete reductive explanation of, for example, life or mind in terms of in physical chemical terms. Right? So yeah, it has this kind of negative heuristics, one can say. Well, can it provide somewhat more specific positive guidance to scientific research? That's much less clear. But one example I kind of thought about when working on this talk was for example, his analysis of the category of heat in the philosophy of nature implies that it's a state of natural bodies, right, of material bodies, rather than some kind of independently existing matter or body. And again, that actually rules out certain theories which were in fact accepted at the time, and leads to or gives way to other theories. So it rules out theories of which explain the phenomena of heat by reference to caloric, right? This special kind of matter used to account for this phenomena, and lends way to the kinetic theory of heat, which was in fact later accepted as the correct one in physics. Okay, so I want to conclude just to summarize. There are no good reasons, as far as I can see, to believe that Hegel did not think that the view of nature as rational can be inimical to empirical science. And in fact, there are reasons to think that at least he thought that at least general elements of the rationalist metaphysics of nature are essential, or at least highly conducive to for the practice of science. Questions remain concerning the extent to which he might have thought that the more specific content of his philosophy of nature could be used as a guide for empirical research. Thank you for your attention.